Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, May 11th, 2020. Last week, we talked in one of the episodes from last week, we talked about the main federal programs that militarize and nationalize local police. And on this episode, I want to dig a little deeper into that and go further back and look at the history of the origins of this massive, monumental shift, this attack on liberty. And if we have a little bit of time, I've got it in my notes to go over some of the plans they even have for militarized police in the future. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We're on a bunch of different platforms. We live stream video-wise on Facebook, YouTube, DLive, Periscope, and Twitch. We also have archive video versions on library.tv. I believe that it's LBRY Library, BitChute, BitTube, and Brighteon.com. And then we have audio-only podcast editions, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, and elsewhere. You can find all the platforms we're on, all of the archives since we started the show almost 2 years ago now, which is amazing because when I first started, I'm like, man, I've got all this equipment at home for video and audio and stuff. I might as well just start talking to people. I didn't really know if it was going to last or not, but I'm so grateful for the many people that keep following, supporting us, joining us as members, like our membership program, leaving reviews on iTunes and elsewhere. I'm very grateful for all of you. Thank you very much for helping make this show a reality and far more consistent than I ever thought it would be. So you can find all of that information on our show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Looking over on the live chat, I just want to say a quick hello to everyone joining me here today live. I appreciate the comments and the feedback and suggestions. I get a lot of ideas for show episodes in the comments. So even if I don't reply to your comments, I'm reading through all of them at some point over the next day or so after the show is done. You can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. So let's say hello to everyone in the live chat. Vivian, Melody, Tyler B, Essential Freedom on YouTube, on Facebook, Michael Bogus, good to see you. Justin Morrison, Jane Stetz Peterson, good to see you. Jeff Stewart, who is awesome. I think Jeff is an awesome dude. Good to see you, buddy. Patricia Dance, Anomalia over on Facebook, who likes the intro. Thank you. Richard Kramer, been a while since we've seen you out there. Thank you for joining us. Anna Reyes, Bob Brewer, Justin Bayola. Bob gives a great reminder from down in Tyler, Texas. Smash the like button, especially if you're on YouTube. The reviews, all that stuff helps tell the algorithm to show the program to more people. Liberty Howell and Benjamin Blondin and Neil and everybody else. Thank you. I'm sorry if I missed anybody. It's not meant to be a slight if I didn't get through it. I'm just trying to scramble through all these different comments on the chat app that I have here. Anyways, I'm rambling at this point. Let's get right to it. First of all, I want to remind everybody, if you haven't checked out this episode that I did last week, Wednesday, War on Liberty, an overview of federal programs that militarize and nationalize local police, I went through the three main programs of how the federal government is handing cash and hardware directly to local law enforcement agencies. And the result of that is they've basically turned them into federal agents many times. So the three main programs are the 1033 program. That's the one that most people know about from the Pentagon. There's also the Department of Homeland Security grant program and the Department of Justice, the JAG. It's another grant program. They're handing out tons of cash. Sometimes they hand out surveillance equipment. Sometimes they hand out just brand new military gear. A lot of people think that it's always old and deprecated, but I think it was like between 30 and 40% of the time in one study, it was brand new stuff. So this is a nasty, unconstitutional federal funding program, a series of them that shouldn't exist. And then they drive, because of this cash and gear that they're handing out, they're basically creating what they the friendly way they put it is they call each other their federal partners. The local law enforcement always say, well, we want to work with our federal partners as much as possible. And I think the motivation, of course, is the cash. We covered asset forfeiture in that. And then we also covered joint task forces. There's literally hundreds of them. A lot of them are on drug war issues, but there's also gun control issues where they have task forces, and drug and gun control go hand in hand. A lot of times they'll use gun charges against suspected drug dealers and vice versa to amplify, and I didn't really cover this, but they do amplify potential sentences and pressure people into doing things. So we covered a lot of that. And mind you, when they're in these joint task forces, local law enforcement are actually deputized as federal agents, and then they're no longer really bound by local or state law or state constitutions. Many of times, like state Bill of Rights are even more restrictive than the federal one. So I encourage you to check out this episode if you haven't done so. That link will be in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So let's get to this. What I really like about this article I want to cover today, I'm going to go through this in some detail. Weapons of War on Our Streets, A Guide to the Militarization of Police. This is written by a guy named Sam Jacobs. I believe he's the head guy over at ammo.com. And what I think is so great about this article is that most of the time over the years, when I've looked at federal militarization of local police, the people who are opposing it, other than principled constitutionalists and libertarians, the kind of a small minority of people, but when you're talking about the loudest voices, the vast majority, most of the time people who are opposing this are like ACLU, BLM, Black Lives Matters groups, things like that. And because of that, unfortunately, a lot of people on the right will have a knee-jerk reaction to say, like, I don't want to have a coalition with those people, because a lot of people have a problem setting aside differences and finding common ground, but it's just a fact. A lot of people just don't want to do that. It's different mentalities, different approaches. And we don't see very often from the more conservative end of the spectrum, especially not from the gun rights end of the spectrum. I know you guys watching and listening are totally on board with restricting government at every level all the time as much as possible. But we don't see it as often, and that's why I think Sam does a really great job coming from that direction. Ammo.com, he's a gun rights guy. I mean, let me read a little bit to set the stage here. He says, a claim often made by those attempting to pass more gun control legislation. He's talking about militarized police, and his first sentence is about gun control. And that's a really great perspective to come at it from. A claim made by those attempting to pass more gun control legislation is that they're trying to get the weapons of war off our streets. We've all heard that. He says, but it's simply untrue that weapons of war, and he puts that in quotes, are available to the general public. You'd last about 3 minutes in a conventional war with an AR-15, he writes, even with one of the most aggressive builds you can get your hands on. He says, the truth is that the only people with weapons of war on America's streets are increasingly the police. Then he goes through some of the grant programs. I'm not going to get into those details. He talks about primarily the 1033 program, which I covered last week. And then he also talks a little bit about joint task forces. And one thing I didn't point out is that SWAT teams, which really kind of go hand in hand with these joint task forces, the amount of activity they've had as the federal government has gotten more involved and driven federal priorities over local law enforcement, which I'll get into a little bit more detail in a bit, has gone up significantly. He says, for example, the number of SWAT raids in the U.S. grew dramatically from about 3,000 in 1980 to a whopping 50,000 in 2014, according to a book, The New Jim Crow, which I've heard about for quite some time now. I have not read it yet. If anybody's read that, I'd love to get some feedback. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And certainly this is a big deal because they're taking things from a completely different perspective when they're approaching it as federal or as militarized, as SWAT teams. And this is how Sam puts it. He says, to say that the militarization of the police is nothing new is to ignore America's recent history, as well as the long-standing model of a peace officer. And we don't hear that from most of the quarters opposing militarization. They just want to have oversight bodies and maybe more congressional control. I think they still like the centralization of power many times. In fact, they just want to have the right Department of Justice run by the right person to dictate to local law enforcement what they can and cannot do, rather than having a federalism style as codified in law under the Constitution or the 10th Amendment. But I mean, even if they have the wrong solutions, I like the idea that they're talking about it. But here Sam is really good. He says, the focus has shifted from one who keeps the peace to one who enforces the law, and that's an important difference. We don't talk about law enforcement enough as they're supposed to be peace officers. And he has a nice section on it talking about this transition from peace officer to law enforcement officer. What is the difference between the two? And he says it's a subtle but important distinction. Is the role of the police to enforce the law or to keep the peace? My perspective is that most laws, and we could say state law under the state constitutions, and federal law under the federal constitutions, and then when local law enforcement becomes part of the federal government through these joint task forces, they're acting as federal agents, and they're unconstitutional probably under both constitutions, both state and federal at the same time. But they're now acting primarily, their number one thing is not thinking about what will make the most peace. It's how can we crush in the most enforcement and get the most numbers so we can get the most funding and most gear out of it. That's my impression of how it really plays out behind the scenes. That's just really kind of a gut instinct. Sam goes on. He says, consider the difference between the police force of a typical American city and the fictional... Is it Andy Taylor? Andy Taylor of the Andy Griffith Show. The former is concerned primarily with enforcing the law for its own sake and catching as many, quote, lawbreakers as possible. The latter, on the other hand, is primarily concerned with keeping the peace, and sometimes that means looking the other way when laws get broken. I have heard Sheriff Richard Mack, who runs Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, CSPOA.org. I don't have a link to that up to show you right now, but just kind of off the top of my head. Many times, Sheriff Mack in speeches would say, you know, let's talk about Rosa Parks. What would have been the right thing to do for a local law enforcement agent at that time? He says, if I was sheriff or if I was called to the scene, I wouldn't have enforced that law. I would have acknowledged that it was a law on the books that said she had to move on the city bus to the back seat. And he's without even thinking about the motivation for the protest or any of it. He said, if there was a problem, I would have gone and I would have escorted her home. That is a different... Now, I don't know. We can all say what we would have done after the fact, but I think it's really a stark example of the difference between going in to smash heads and force stuff because it's the law versus looking at the situation holistically and saying, you know, what's going to be the best way to keep the peace in the scenario, to treat people with dignity and respect. And again, I think it's subtle, as Sam puts it, but it's an important distinction, the difference between enforcing the law as their motivation or keeping the peace. And then we're looking over here. He gets to this section on the origins of militarized police. And he says, before we begin talking about this, it's worth mentioning that U.S. law specifically prohibits the military from enforcing laws in the U.S. So because of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which was passed after the removal of federal troops from southern states following the Reconstruction, you can't have the military. So what has the federal government done instead of having the military enforced over decades and decades and decades? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this history. They have worked to ramp up their involvement in local law enforcement, pressuring them to act on federal activities and then providing them the equipment to do so. And again, back to those various grant programs and joint task forces, and then, of course, civil asset forfeiture. I'll cover that again. He says, however, this law has been somewhat undermined due to police forces becoming so much like the military, which began during Prohibition in the 1920s. I don't actually know if there was problems before that. And generally, when we see that there's an issue that starts, usually the foundation for that was often decades earlier. So, for example, the incorporation doctrine under the 14th Amendment, this was the 14th Amendment here. It's passed after the Civil War in the late 1860s, and then the incorporation doctrine didn't even start until the federal courts started saying it did in the 1920s. So the foundation for these things are set at one time. It may seem innocuous at one point, but then government will always find ways to use whatever crack in the door they have open to kick it wide open and expand centralized power at every chance possible. So I'm not sure if what started before Prohibition in the 20s, but he's noting that this kind of thing really ramped up. And again, this is an example of government creating a problem. Now, mind you, this is the government through the people, through an amendment that was approved through the amendment process, and then government came in and tried to do stuff, right? So it began during Prohibition in the 1920s. They come in, they have a problem, and then they try to fix it. He said the Prohibition era saw domestic police departments wielding automatic weapons for the first time. And no one thought it was really nefarious. They were trying to deal with armed up gangsters. Now, the gangsters really only existed in Prohibition because of government prohibition. He says at least 2 rounds of ammunition, like the .38 Super and the .357 Magnum, were developed with the express purpose of being able to penetrate the early bulletproof vests worn by gangsters in the Prohibition era. And one thing that I thought was really interesting about this article is he used some statistics. I'm not sure. There's links in here. Everything is highlighted. So, like, for example, .38 Super, if you're watching the video, or later on if you're reading through this and you may have listened to the podcast, anything that's highlighted red is an active link. You can click into that and learn a little bit more about it as well. But he used some statistics here, and he says overall crime increased by 24% during the first 2 years of Prohibition. 9% increase in theft and burglary, 13% increase in homicides, 13% increase in assault and battery. Is this just because of gangsters violating the law, the federal Prohibition law, or is there something else happening? He says a study of South Carolina counties that enforced Prohibition. Now, mind you, just a quick aside, not everybody enforced the Volstead Act. A lot of states thought they had to, but a number of them, and I think by a certain time, there were like 25 states that literally did not provide funding to enforce the federal act, and therefore it just fell to pieces. So we actually can do some study and see how things played out in areas that actually aggressively enforced the federal law rather than focusing on local priorities, and vice versa. And he says the study in South Carolina counties that enforced Prohibition versus those who didn't found a whopping 30 to 60% increase. That's a wide range, but even 30%. Let's just say 30% on the low end of the scale. Increase in homicides in the counties who enforced the federal law. So what happens? Again, and I talked about this last week in the episode on militarization, when the federal government drives local law enforcement to act as federal agents, they're not focusing on local priorities. And what has been the result here? Death. More death. 30% increase, minimum 30% increase, at least in this one small sample in South Carolina, where they were acting as federal agents more often, rather than when they were acting more like peace officers. And maybe they weren't really being peace officers at the time as much, but certainly compared to today. So that's a really important distinction. Then he goes through another wave of militarization. So really we're looking all the way back to Prohibition, government problem, reaction, and then a government solution, of course. He says the second wave of police militarization began with the race riots in the 50s and 60s, and then the Watts riots here in Southern California in 1965, gaining a sort of gravitas. The LAPD used military-style weapons and tactics to end the riots. What's more, an increasingly militant civil rights movement was seen by the CIA, probably in the FBI as well, as an arm of international communism. Sam writes, while there is some merit to this view, it's certainly true that it led to a philosophy of increasingly militarized police. When you've got bad guys at your door, not saying that they're all, but let's say, for the sake of argument, The CIA was right. I don't think the CIA is right very often. I don't trust them. This is the deep state. This is its own government. They have their own military. There's black budgets. We don't know what they do, so I don't trust them. But let's say they were totally honest in this time, and these civil rights movements was really about being used as a tool to advance communism. Well, you still stay within the Constitution to deal with it. Going further, he says urban unrest included not just race riots like Watts riots or 67 riots in Detroit, but also the riot outside the 1968 Democratic Party convention, Democratic terrorist organizations like the Weather Underground, the Symbionese Liberation Army, which I'd never heard of before reading this, and the Earth Liberation Front, which is still around today, likewise offered increased challenges to law enforcement. I would also want to point out that even here in California, you wouldn't think of California as a gun rights state, but back in the 60s, it absolutely was. I mean, in many ways. Look at this picture. This is an article from History.com about the history of the Mulford Act. This is where the NRA actually opposed open carry. They were fine with it, but then these civil rights groups, and maybe some people thought they were commies, whatever, but they are holding their guns in public. And here's armed members of the Black Panther Party standing in the corridor of the Capitol in Sacramento protesting a bill that restricted the carrying of arms in public. 1967. We hear about armed protesters in Michigan in the Capitol, and everyone complains about it. But this type of thing has been happening for decades when people can take, but it's always attacked. It doesn't matter which side does it. They always don't like it. Government doesn't like it when people can defend themselves. They don't like it when people have lots of firepower because then it makes their military ineffective and unimportant. And of course, and I did an episode on this about a year ago, May 20th, 2019, standing armies, why the founders wanted you to own military-style weapons. One of the reasons for the right to keep and bear arms, why the founders were so much in support of the Second Amendment. This isn't just about hunting. This isn't just about protecting your home and your family and property, although these are parts of it. This isn't just about defending against your own government being tyrannical. It is about not needing a large standing army. And when you think about people like James Madison, George Mason, and so many others, basically everybody opposed large, permanent standing armies. Some of them wanted small, permanent armies. They didn't want them to be large. Others just opposed standing armies completely. Madison himself told us that war is the greatest threat to public liberty because war gives us armies. And from armies proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes, according to James Madison, were the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. So one of the reasons we're supposed to have these military-style weapons is so we don't have to have an armed-up government. We can protect ourselves. That's kind of a side note that I wanted to mention as well. Now, going back to Sam's article, he talks about a little bit about civil asset forfeiture. I'm not going to cover that in detail. I covered that in more detail last week. But he says, here's a short list of military hardware purchased with civil asset forfeiture funds. And I would think in many situations, a lot of it is civil asset forfeiture funds from the Federal Equitable Sharing Program, where the feds keep 20% of the take and they give locals who act as federal agents 80%. Just a short list. $5 million helicopter for the LAPD. $1 million mobile command bus for Prince George County, Maryland. A $227,000 for a tank. Maybe it was a Bearcat, some kind of tracked vehicle in Douglasville, Georgia, a town with a population of 32,000. Or $54,000. This one I think really stuck out the most. $54,000 for 27 M4 assault rifles in Brazelton, Georgia, a town with a population of $9,476. It's not just the money. And although that's a problem, because taxation is theft, they're stealing from us all the time. They're stealing from us to supposedly make us safe, but they're really not doing that. It's just so they can control us. They steal the money from us. It goes through layers of bureaucracy, and then it gets dished out to local law enforcement, where they have all these M4 rifles in Brazelton, Georgia. Like, why do they need those for a population of 9,500 people? That's not acting like a peace officer at all. And then he says, and I think this is really interesting, kind of go through some of the situations that we've seen rise over the years that always provide an excuse for them to arm up more and more and more. He says it's one thing to discuss police militarization simply in terms of weapons acquisition. It's another to discuss police militarization in terms of actual incidents. Some high-profile incidents involving heavily militarized police are worth examining. There's the MOVE organization in 1985. They bombed one of the buildings. The resulting fire spread to a total of 65 houses and caused 11 deaths, including 5 children under the age of 13. There's Ruby Ridge, the Branch Davidians, and he says of the Branch Davidian compound, this is perhaps one of, if not the archetypal examples of a militarized police force greatly overreaching. And we can watch documentaries and TV shows about that all day long to learn more about it as well. And I think that's a really important point to talk about how those things gave them excuses to continue gearing up, expanding SWAT forces, expanding joint task forces. And back to SWAT teams, he says, here's some startling facts when it comes to them. 62% of them are for drug raids. And of course, that is primarily a federal priority. They're acting in federal joint task forces. So they're acting as federal agents. And if we look back at alcohol prohibition, we saw, at least from the statistics in South Carolina, and hopefully somebody does more research on this in the future, we saw that where they acted as federal agents, in essence, that would have been the joint task forces of the time enforcing the Volstead Act for the feds. We saw that this had a result of more homicides in those counties that were, because they just weren't acting the way they should be as police or as peace officers. He said 79% of SWAT deployments are done on private residences and only 7%. So they promise they're going to do one thing, and then it always expands. 7% of all raids were done for situations SWAT was invented for, namely barricades or hostage situations. So they tell you, like the income tax was originally going to be a temporary wartime measure of a few percentage points on the richest of the rich, and no one else was going to ever have to deal with this ever again. And here we are, $25+ trillion in national debt. Everyone is taxed. I mean, the people who aren't paying income tax, they're paying all kinds of other taxes, that it's trickle-down taxation where everyone is affected by the intense amount of spending by government at all levels, the intense expansion of government at all levels, and the, well, that's a whole nother situation. He says even smaller cities have SWAT teams now, which raises the question of why. Mission creep is the short answer, with SWAT teams now being used for operations far beyond the original scope of their work. What a surprise. Government always grows. Put simply, Sam writes, the SWAT team was not created to serve every search warrant that comes across the desk of a small-town police force, or any police force for that matter. And I think we do have a few minutes. I don't want to skip over this. He talks about DARPA, some futuristic weapons that they want to use, and some of them they're already using. For example, active denial system. Where are things going to go? What type of stuff are they going to use against the people in a protest? Today, tomorrow, in 6 months, 10 years, we should actually keep an eye on this stuff. And he's talking about DARPA. What are they building? He's also acknowledging that when they build stuff for the military, eventually it ends up in the hands of local law enforcement. And a lot of law enforcement come right from the military, so they just know the tactics and the gear. He says, since there's clearly an established pipeline from the Pentagon's latest and greatest toys, it's not much of a stretch to say that the weapons being developed by the Pentagon today are going to be used on the streets of America in the very near future. In fact, there's an entire department of the Pentagon dedicated to developing futuristic weapons to help the U.S. win the new arms. It's called the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, commonly known as DARPA. It didn't exist until a few years. It didn't exist. Just like NSA was no such agency. That was kind of the joke behind the scenes. James Bamford has a great book on that as well. And so here are some of the weapons in development right now by DARPA. Active denial systems. It's an invisible ray gun, heating the skin of people in a given area to 130 degrees. The targets flee, something that DARPA calls the goodbye effect. The end result can leave second or third degree burns on up to 20% of the body's surface. It has already been tested in Afghanistan. I mean, the idea that people protesting should have a burn because they're not allowed or they didn't get the right permit, that does not sound like a positive situation. There's the Taser X12. He says everyone's familiar with the Taser, but the X12 is effectively that in a 12-gauge shotgun form. It extends the reach of a Taser weapon from 20 feet to about 100. skull-piercing microwaves. He says, yep, you read that right. Some of this stuff, I'm like clicking the links. One of these, the last one here, I clicked through and I did a bunch of Google searches, and it kind of blows my mind that these things exist. So I'm very grateful for Sam putting these in here and just briefly touching on them and giving us links to read about it a little bit more. He says, skull-piercing microwaves. Yeah, you read this right. One of the projects DARPA is working on right now leverages the audio effect of microwaves. This creates shock waves inside the skull, which are read by the brain as sound. This can result in discomfort, incapacitation, and brain damage. And this one they're actually using. I know they've used this in multiple situations. He cited Pittsburgh against protesters in 2009, but from my understanding, it's been used far more often. They're LRADs, long-range acoustic devices. He says sirens might not sound like a big deal, but the current ones being worked on by DARPA are so loud they can cause permanent hearing damage very quickly. It's a sound cannon. They blast sound at a protest. Again, illegal protest. I mean, there should be no such thing. It's an oxymoron. I guess that's the right phrase for it. There's no such thing as an illegal protest, really. These are sonic weapons. They blast at people. They like burst eardrums, and people just run. And that's how you're going to break things up. They're going to have to find ways to deal with this. And this is the last one that I really dug into that I'm like, man, this can't be real. The voice of God. He said, this one sounds impossible, but it's not. And the link in But It's Not goes to Wired Magazine, which does a lot of technology research. It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a weapon beaming words directly into your head so that you think God is talking to you. This leverages the same technology in LRADs, but for a different effect. And summing it up, he says, these are just a few of the weapons that we know about. There are almost certainly far more frightening classified weapons coming down the pike over the next decade. And I don't want to be like super conspiracy, but because I think there's so much that we can look at that government does right now that we don't really have to think behind the scenes. But I think it's important to look behind the scenes to see what they're developing, because that's what they want to use on people in the future. And when they want to use it on the so-called terrorists overseas, eventually someone's going to see you exercising your right to keep and bear arms, to assemble, whatever it may be, as terroristic or dangerous today or somewhere down the line. You may trust a politician or a law enforcement agent or a sheriff or whatever with that power today. But as the founders warned us, never trust these people, because what power you give them today can be used by someone else against you tomorrow. Sam Jacobs does a great summary on this, and he ties it all the way back to the right to keep and bear arms. He says the most heavily armed gangs on the street aren't your local street gangs. It's law enforcement. They have weapons far in excess to that of the average citizen or even the average criminal. This means resisting them can easily be deadly, even when you're within your legal rights. He says this raises a point worthy of consideration. The usual suspects will cry and rage at your ability to legally own an AR-15, a right codified by the U.S. Constitution. Rare, though, is the gun grabber who makes any kind of stink when police use directed energy weapons. Remember that gun grabbers aren't against guns. They're just against yours. That bears repeating. Remember that gun grabbers aren't against guns. They're just against yours. They just want government to be armed up as in ways that make a dystopian fiction seem tame. They don't want you to defend yourself. And that again goes back to that episode I was talking about. The founders wanted the people to be armed up, so then there could be far less excuses to call on the government to do the same. Well, I hope you guys are finding this interesting and educational. I'm going to take a quick look in the live chat and see what some people have to say. Bill Yeager says disband police unions and privatize the cops. And I'll tell you, the police unions, the lobby unions, are the most aggressive. When we're working on nullification legislation, which would normally be happening this time of year, when we work on bills to ban law enforcement from doing civil asset forfeiture, mass surveillance, and especially gun control, the top opposition, like on gun control, isn't from the gun-grabbing lobby. They do oppose stuff. It really is from the law enforcement unions. And I think the unions, again, this is a problem with the whole union model, I guess. They're really tied in on the whole funding situation that comes from Washington, D.C. on this stuff. They don't want to cut back on enforcement because that means cut back on the amount of personnel. And the last thing a union ever wants is a cutback on spending and budgets and personnel. So they fight this tooth and nail. And there are very few, especially when you're talking about the right to keep and bear arms. When you're talking about advancing the right to keep and bear arms, you're primarily relying on Republicans to do the right thing in state legislatures. Republicans bad on so many other things, but maybe they can be pushed in the right direction, even when they're bad on the right to keep and bear arms, as so many are. Sometimes you can push them in the right direction because they have to, because if they don't and they're a Republican, they're going to get challenged from the hard right. The general public oftentimes thinks they're a failure. So they really want to do good things on the right to keep and bear arms, even if they don't care about it. But they also put a priority above that. They don't ever reject what the police say. And we've heard this for years. Well, I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, but law enforcement tells us that they aren't taking anyone's gun rights, and they need these tools to keep our streets safe. And I'm on board with the police. So they can somehow override that. And maybe that's because the general public falls for that garbage as well. But good point on that, Bill. Vivian Venetia, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. She says, my uncle's been talking about DARPA since he came back from Nam. Yeah, I think a lot of people in the conspiracy world heard about that, but didn't actually have a way to prove it. Essential Freedom says the people need EMP weapons to combat this, maybe. And BiddyTube says, Voice of God has been around for a long time, and I understand how it works. It actually is quite simple. Interesting. Jeff Stewart, law enforcement is your local street game? Yeah, of course. I mean, man, I get why people want to support the Andy Griffith Show mentality of what the local police is, but that just doesn't exist in most places. Come visit Los Angeles. I know a lot of you probably wouldn't ever want to step foot here, but let's say you want to go and get some good food with me and hang out. I'll tell you what, man, the last thing you want to see is a gang of cops walk around because they're dangerous and they don't care about your rights. And I think that's what happens in a lot of these larger cities. And they say, as California goes, so goes the nation. So watch how things go here or with the NYPD and how they treat people's essential liberty. And I think that's how it will progress to other areas as well. Anyways, I will go back and look through the comments a little bit more later. I really appreciate you joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something. That's the most important. I love how Sam Jacobs from over at ammo.com, it looks like his bio says he's the lead writer and chief historian at ammo.com. He does really, really great work, and hopefully we'll be publishing some more stuff by him in the near future. I will link to all that stuff. It's primarily his article and then a couple of other things. I will link to that, the other episode, in the show notes. If you enjoyed the show, you can do a few things that are totally cost-free. It costs you nothing. That helps us spread the word, because the algorithms of all these platforms are generally pretty easily triggered. When you take actions on the platform, it tells the algorithm to show the program to more people. So like smashing a like button, commenting, leaving a review on iTunes or elsewhere. All of those free things help out a lot. Subscribing, getting notifications. And if you really want to pitch in, you support our work here on this show or the 10th Amendment Center more generally, you can support us through our membership program, which starts out as little as $2 a month. Please do not feel any pressure. I know it's very difficult for a lot of people. I'm grateful for everyone who is keeping us financially afloat. But if you are able to, please consider it. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I hope you had a good weekend. I hope you had a nice Mother's Day. And I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.